Hi, so yeah, I'm Jason McKeown, and I work actually as a physician in the UK. I've got a bit of experience kind of in neuroscience, neurology, also in emergency medicine, but I suppose my real subspecialty would be kind of neurostimulation, and I was actually invited out to the University of California in San Diego to take a visiting scholar position there. And really to just look at how we can influence the brain through a non-invasive way and actually try and improve in any sense sort of overall performance, but then actually just as my research developed over the years, we've really specialized in this area of your brain which controls metabolism and fat storage, and really we're looking at how we can improve that. So, I mean, health and fitness is just progressing. The last, decade, we've seen massive leaps in sort of fitness tech and health tech. But actually, one area which isn't improving and it's perpetually getting worse is just generalized obesity. So, some pretty shocking figures when you think about it. There are about 2 billion people across the world who are now either overweight or obese. And that traditionally was seen as kind of a Western or affluent type disease, but now actually the two fastest growing obesity areas are China and India, and we're expecting figures to increase for at least another 30 years or so. So it's predicted by around 2050 that actually half of the world will be obese. So right now in the US, about 70% of all adults are actually overweight or obese. So here in the US, you are twice as likely to be overweight than you are to actually be a normal weight. And now actually we're seeing that this is not even just limited to adults. So I mean, a shocking statistic from last year was that 41 million children are obese. And by children, I mean 1 to 5 year olds. So 41 million 1 to 5 year olds now suffer from obesity. And it's not like we're not sort of trying to deal with this. I mean, the money that goes into the research and development trying to tackle this problem is colossal. And in the next few years, we're actually going to reach a tipping point of about $250 billion spent just trying to slow down people becoming overweight and people becoming obese. And there are actually two sort of separate challenges in this. People sort of think it's kind of one kind of unified thing, it's just being obese. You can really split it into two, and that would be people who are already obese or who have been obese for some time. And actually when you look at the neurology, they actually have different sort of neural pathways that have formed or neurological changes, and they are actually in a different category. And then the second part of that is those who are heading towards obesity. So those who are actually actively sort of gaining weight and not getting on top of it. Technically, they don't have a disease process as of yet, but very soon they're going to move into that category where they have permanent neurological changes. So interestingly, when you look at all the technology, the medical devices around actually treating obesity, they tend to focus on this idea of kind of calorie reduction or nutrition reduction. So I mean, we're all pretty familiar with things like gastric bands. That's advanced a little. We've now got like gastric balloons. There's actually now a medical device that's FDA approved recently where it's literally like a tube comes out of your stomach, and after you eat, you put water in the tube and it sort of flushes the contents of your stomach, down the toilet. So it's all based on this sort of nutritional deficit, and certainly that does work, but it actually tends to plateau. So if you look at the gastric bands or gastric balloons, you get really good weight loss at the start, and then actually it plateaus, and in some cases you can actually end up just gaining the weight back again. So our research is really based around an area of your brain. It's called your hypothalamus, and it is ultimately the cornerstone of the obesity problem. And certainly calories in, calories out, we really like that sort of terminology. That is true to some point, but it doesn't take into consideration that your hypothalamus actually adjusts quite rigorously your calories out. So for example, if you're overweight or obese and you start to diet and exercise, you see an increase in your calories out, but your hypothalamus actually picks that up and it actively adjusts things like your metabolic hormones, your metabolic rate, your appetite, your mood, your motivation, to try and stop you actually losing body fat. So your hypothalamus is actually, it can be your best friend or it can be your worst enemy. If you're sort of naturally tuned to being lean, then you have no problem and you can pretty much eat whatever you want. And we all know those people who just eat whatever they want and they will not gain weight. But then similarly, if your hypothalamus is kind of attuned to you being overweight or carrying more weight than you would like, whenever you start to diet, your hypothalamus actually kind of picks up that it's almost a starvation to some degree. So we've all sort of heard of starvation mode. That is actually a sort of a neurological event, and basically what happens is your hypothalamus will adjust things, it'll drop your metabolic rate, pushes your appetite right up, even changes things like insulin production to try and make you store fat. Now, unfortunately, this mechanism has really been honed and refined for millennia of evolution. So if you think of the scenario that tests evolutionary mechanisms, what is most likely to have happened in the past? Were you most likely to have died from starvation, or were you most likely to have died because you're in such an affluent time that you had so much food that you were actually eating yourself to death? So of course it's the starvation one. So this mechanism to stop you reducing body fat, it is almost perfect. So whenever you then get in this position where you're overweight, it's just, once that mechanism cuts in, yes, you initially can lose some weight, but eventually you will tail off. And it's so good, in fact, that 95% of all weight loss attempts are going to fail. And if you sort of yo-yo diet on and off, you're actually 2/3 more likely to gain weight by dieting, which seems just crazy. But anyway, so trying to just hammer home the point, this is all driven by your hypothalamus. Interestingly, the work that I do, we're trying to influence the hypothalamus, and it's been known for about 50 years that there is a sensory input into your hypothalamus. It's actually your vestibular system, so what we might traditionally sort of call our sense of balance. In a primitive sense, actually, it was more a sense of physical activity. So your hypothalamus is always taking information from various parts of your brain and your body, but one is this vestibular system about how physically active you were. And in the height of the space race, I think it was 1972, there were papers that started coming out that sort of showed a bit of a curiosity around animal models in what was called a hypergravity environment. And the curiosity was that they got extremely lean, even though they were eating the same amount of calories and they were doing the same amount of activity. And those experiments were carried out, basically, mice were just in a normal caged environment. They had access to sort of food as required, but the entire environment was spinning around. And the reason it was spinning around was to sort of simulate hypergravity, because basically NASA were interested to see what happens to the physiological changes when you go into space. So they were recording all sorts of things like circadian rhythm and hormone levels, but they also noticed that mice got very, very, very lean. But it wasn't actually until about 2002 when these experiments were repeated, and they were actually repeated with mice who had no vestibular system, so that they had removed the vestibular input. And the mechanisms actually became quite clear. It was actually the vestibular stimulation that was causing the reduction in body fat. So the vestibular system, and this is quite a complicated drawing, but it's really just showing the pathway. So cranial nerve 8 in the top left is your vestibular nerve, which is right behind your ear. And then it goes in through the brainstem, what we call the vestibulo-autonomic reflex, and that really, I suppose, manages energy consumption, energy balance, and then eventually makes its way through to the hypothalamus, but also just to overall autonomic function, which would control things like fat storage and autonomic outflow. So really the crucial part of this is that we're getting from the vestibular system to the hypothalamus. Interestingly, if anyone's interested in sort of vagus nerve stimulation, there's a vagus nerve treatment for obesity. Vagus nerve is actually cranial nerve 10, which is in the bottom left corner. So vestibular nerve stimulation and vagus nerve stimulation are actually very, very similar. The big benefit for vestibular nerve stimulation is you can actually just stick a pad on, a little electrode pad, and put a little electrical sort of impulse through the skin, and it actually activates the vestibular nuclei in the brainstem and then influences the hypothalamus. So the research we were doing really was based on all of that. We ran sort of our initial pilot studies, this was a few years ago, on about 30 people. We sort of split them up into groups. They were receiving just electrical vestibular stimulation. We developed a little headset, and we looked at total body fat. We also looked at how much fat metabolism you have at rest, and we also looked at metabolic hormones and appetite. And I'd say across all of those changes, we were able to see quite significant positive results. So we scaled that up. By the end of this year, we hope to run about 300 people through sort of double-blind, sham-controlled trials. And the purpose of all of that is actually we're sort of in an ongoing dialogue with the FDA to try and actually get this approved as an obesity treatment. So it will be basically a headset you wear 1 hour a day, stimulates the vestibular system, which then influences the hypothalamus, and then with time we see a reduction in body fat. So the target is actually to have that in the FDA-approved kind of prescription pathway by middle of 2019. But interestingly, and this is quite unique, because it is a wearable, a very sort of low-risk, non-invasive device, we've actually been able to go straight to the consumer market just as a general weight loss device. So we launched it, you may be familiar with sort of Kickstarter and Indiegogo, and really the idea was to try and get, I suppose, just to get real-life user data. So yes, you have all this lab data, it's very controlled, but what happens when you put it out in real life? People with thyroid problems, people with diabetes, people with different medications. Sometimes actually the translational data doesn't really happen, so it looks good in the lab, but in real life, does it actually work as well as that? So we tried to raise about $50,000 on Indiegogo, but the demand was sort of crazy, and we actually raised $2 million. So that's about 4,000 headsets across about 84 countries. But what's most important is we're actually getting what I call real-life data. So we've analysed about 50,000 sessions of Modius use, and we are seeing actually quite compelling results. So 80% of people are seeing a positive result by about week 6, and the average is actually about 6 pounds in sort of fat reduction. I think actually the best result at 6 weeks was something like 23 pounds. Now obviously that is a mixture of lifestyle changes. Some people are sort of dieting and exercising, trying to lose weight. That's something we actively encourage. Some other people are actually not trying, they're almost sort of testing us. That is also fine. But the average, as I say, 6 weeks, 6 pounds, and about 80% of people see that. So here's some graphs. And then the other big thing we're seeing, which is quite compelling, is there is a clear correlation between use and actual weight loss. So the more you use it, the more weight you lose. And we've actually changed our approach now. We had previously said 5 times a week is probably enough, but we've now changed that to say 7 times a week, because there is a clear correlation between just use and weight loss. So just in summary then, what we're trying to do is, I suppose, bring out this technology into the market. There are 2 pathways. There's this sort of obesity treatment pathway. We're looking at that mid-2019, but at the moment we're going forward with this general weight loss device. We're seeing very, very sort of positive results so far. It is early days. We're really, really excited about how it goes. But overall, what we're trying to do is just make that entire sort of weight loss burden easier by targeting that fundamental issue, which is your hypothalamus. So thanks very much. Yeah.